In 1968, a scientist built what looked like paradise for mice. No predators, no hunger, no rain, no cold, no landlord. Which for mice is surprisingly important, because mice are terrible with paperwork. There was food, water, nesting material, and hundreds of little apartments built into the walls. The first residents were only 8 mice, 4 males, 4 females. A tiny founding population, placed inside a world where almost every normal threat had been removed. And then, after a few years, every mouse was gone. This is the story of Universe 25, the most famous experiment of John B. Calhoun. It is often presented as a simple warning. Give animals comfort and crowding, and society collapses. Then someone usually points vaguely at modern life, apartment buildings, dating apps, social media, or whatever they personally dislike this week. But the real experiment is stranger than the meme. And the lesson is much less convenient. Calhoun was not a cartoon villain building a mouse apocalypse for fun. He was an ethologist at the National Institute of Mental Health, studying how animals organize themselves under pressure. He noticed something disturbing. When animals became crowded, the problem was not only physical density, it was social contact. Too many encounters, too many interruptions, too many individuals trying to find a place in a system that had run out of places. Calhoun called one pattern a behavioral sink. Animals gathered in certain areas, even when better options existed elsewhere. Social contact itself seemed to become a trap. Universe 25 was designed to test what would happen if ordinary causes of death were greatly reduced. The mice had abundant food. They had water. They had shelter. They had nesting material. They had protection from predators and most disease. In theory, this should have been a golden age of mouse civilization. In practice, it became a very small society with no way out. At first, everything looked successful. After the original 8 mice adjusted to the enclosure, the population began to grow rapidly. The number of mice doubled about every 55 days. The graph climbed like someone had accidentally fed math after midnight. But hidden inside that success was the beginning of the failure. Mouse society is not just a pile of mice. It has territories, hierarchies, courtship, parenting, retreat, conflict, and escape. A losing mouse in the wild can leave. It can find a worse place, a quieter place, a risky place, but at least it has a direction to run. In Universe 25, there was nowhere to go. That detail matters. The experiment did not simply create abundance. It created abundance without exit. As the population increased, the strongest males controlled the most desirable territories. Other males were pushed into the middle areas. These displaced mice had no territory, no stable role, and no path to start over somewhere else. They clustered together, became wounded, and were often caught in chaotic fighting that served no useful purpose. It was not heroic combat. It was more like a comment section with fur. The pressure also reached the females. Mothers were disturbed. Nests became unstable. Pups were neglected, abandoned, or attacked. Young mice were forced into independence before they had properly learned the social behaviors they needed. And this is where the story becomes more unsettling than a simple tale about overcrowding. The colony did not collapse because the mice ran out of food. It did not collapse because every apartment was full. At the peak, there were still unused nesting spaces. The physical resources had not vanished. What collapsed was the social system that allowed the mice to use those resources normally. By around day 560, the population reached its peak of roughly 2,200 mice. Then growth stopped. Births declined. Deaths began to exceed births. By day 600, the last surviving young had been born. That sentence is easy to pass over, so let it sit for a moment. There were still males. There were still females. There was still food. There was still water. There was still shelter. but the future of the colony had already ended. The remaining mice were alive, but the society was reproductively dead. One of the most famous groups in the experiment became known as the beautiful ones. These were mice, especially males, that avoided fighting and mating. They had few wounds. Their coats looked clean. They spent their time eating, drinking, sleeping, and grooming. In other words, they lived the influencer version of mouse life. No conflict, no commitment, excellent skincare. But they also did not participate in the behaviors needed to continue the colony. They were not evil. They were not lazy in a moral sense. They were products of a broken developmental environment. They had survived inside a society where the complex behaviors of mouse life had failed to mature. Calhoun saw this as more than physical death. He described a kind of first death, the death of complex social behavior before the death of the body. In Universe 25, the mice did not simply die. First, the behaviors that made their society reproduce itself broke down. Then the animals aged out. The bodies followed the social collapse. By 1973, the experiment had become a symbol. People saw in it whatever they were already afraid of. Universe 25 became a mirror, and everyone brought their own face. But this is where we have to be careful. Mice are not tiny humans wearing cheaper suits. Human cities are not laboratory enclosures. A population density number is not the same as the felt experience of crowding. Humans have language, culture, laws, friendship, public parks, and the ability to leave a group chat. Sometimes. So Universe 25 does not prove that modern society is doomed. And it definitely does not prove that one rodent room can explain your dating life. The experiment had limitations. It was observational. It involved an artificial enclosure. Later scientists questioned whether its results were overinterpreted. There were possible confounding factors, and the conditions were not a simple model of human society. Today, the ethical standards for such animal research would be very different. So the most useful lesson is not humans are mice. The useful lesson is social animals need more than material resources. They need usable space, not just measurable space. They need roles. They need autonomy. They need ways to withdraw, ways to belong, and ways to begin again after failure. A society can have enough calories and still damage the relationships that make life work. It can have enough buildings and still not provide belonging. It can have endless contact and still produce loneliness. That may be the part of Universe 25 that still feels uncomfortable. Not because it gives us a perfect prophecy, it doesn't, but because it asks a sharper question. What happens when a social system becomes so crowded with contact, status, interruption, and competition that individuals can no longer form stable roles inside it? What happens when there is no famine, no predator, and no obvious emergency, but people still feel trapped? The answer is not written in a mouse cage. It never was. The answer depends on choices humans can actually make. We can create institutions where people are not treated as interchangeable bodies in a box. We can notice the difference between being surrounded and being connected. Calhoun's mice had food, water, shelter, and safety. On paper, they had everything. But life is not lived on paper. And a world can look like paradise from the outside while quietly failing the creatures inside it. That is the real danger of the Calhoun effect. Not that comfort automatically destroys us. Not that population growth guarantees collapse. Not that mice secretly predicted the 21st century. The danger is mistaking the checklist for the life. Universe 25 ended with extinction inside a protected world. But the point is not to panic at the word population. The point is to ask what kind of social environment turns survival into withdrawal. Because the mice did not die in a desert. They died in a utopia. And that is why the experiment still refuses to leave us alone.